The further Elena drove, the more her mind seemed to race. The sounds of the road faded, and all she could hear was the frantic pounding of her heartbeat in her ears. She glanced in the rearview mirror again. The road behind her was still empty, nothing but the winding highway and the dark expanse of the woods. She could feel her palms sweating on the steering wheel, her fingers gripping it so tightly that they ached. The car's headlights barely cut through the thick darkness around her. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching overhead, casting strange shadows across the road. Elena's thoughts were scattered. Her rational mind told her that she had to keep going, that the creature was just a figment of her imagination. It was late, she was exhausted, and she had been driving for hours. Maybe she had simply imagined it, or maybe it was some sort of strange trick of the light. But then she remembered the clicking sound. The way its mouth had opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. That was no illusion. That was real. Her mind flashed back to the moment she had first seen it, the way the creature had stood still in the woods, its yellow eyes glowing with an unsettling, almost predatory gleam. It had felt like time had stopped. She had never been so terrified in her life. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, and she fought the urge to look behind her again. She didn't want to know if it was following her. She didn't want to see its twisted form emerge from the shadows, its monstrous figure coming after her. But as she drove deeper into the night, the feeling of being watched never left her. She could almost feel its eyes on her back, like an invisible weight pressing against her. Elena's eyes darted nervously from the road to the woods, to the rearview mirror, and back again. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She was trapped in this endless stretch of highway, with no one around to help her. The loneliness of the situation sank in. She hadn't seen another car in hours. No streetlights. No signs of civilization. She was isolated in the middle of nowhere, and whatever that thing had been, it wasn't just a random occurrence. It was deliberate. It was hunting her. She didn't know how much time had passed when she finally saw something ahead in the distance. A faint glow of light, something that broke the monotony of the dark road. She squinted, trying to make out what it was. A gas station? A house? A turnoff to a main road? As she got closer, the faint glow took shape. It was a sign, hanging from a pole. The faint, flickering lights were the only sign of life she had seen for miles. Relief washed over her. Maybe this would be her chance to get out, to call for help, or at least to find some comfort in the company of others. But when she reached the sign, her stomach dropped. The sign was old, rusted, and falling apart. The faint glow wasn't from the lights of a business but from a few dim, flickering bulbs overhead, casting an eerie glow on the abandoned building in front of her. The station, if it had ever been one, was long deserted. The pumps were rusted and covered in layers of grime. The building itself looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was no one there. The silence was almost deafening. Elena slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just a few feet from the gas station. She stared at the desolate building for a moment, trying to process what she was seeing. She should have kept driving. She should have just passed it by, but her exhaustion was overwhelming. She needed a break, even if it was just for a moment. With shaky hands, she turned off the engine. The quiet that enveloped her was suffocating. For a few moments, Elena just sat there in the car, staring at the gas station, her mind racing. Was this place even real? Had she imagined it? The world outside seemed to be pressing in on her. The darkness of the night felt thicker, more oppressive, and the wind rustled through the trees like whispers. She wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but the air had a weight to it. A heaviness. Her breath quickened again, and for a moment, Elena considered getting out of the car, going into the building, hoping to find some trace of life. But something inside her, some primal instinct, told her to stay put. It felt wrong. That's when she heard it again. The clicking sound. It came from the trees. Faint at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder with each passing second. Elena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The clicking wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate. The same unsettling sound she had heard earlier. The sound of bones grinding against each other. It was closer now. Elena's eyes darted from the woods to the rearview mirror, and then back to the darkness outside. The creature was out there. She was certain of it now. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real. She reached for the door handle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. If she could just get out of the car, find some kind of shelter, she might be able to escape it. But her hand froze before she could even touch the handle. Something wasn't right. The clicking sound had stopped. But the stillness that followed was even worse. Her eyes locked on the rearview mirror again, her body tensing as she watched the shadows shift behind her. The trees were unnaturally still. No wind. No movement. It was as though everything had stopped. Then, she saw it. It was just a flicker at first, a movement in the corner of her vision. But Elena's heart nearly stopped as she saw the creature's face reflected in the rearview mirror. The thing that had been following her. The thing that had been waiting. Its twisted face, with hollow, sunken eyes, was staring at her from the darkness. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Panic flooded her chest, and without thinking, she slammed her foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the dirt road as she floored the accelerator. The car shot forward, but just as she thought she was safe, something heavy struck the back of the car. The vehicle jolted violently, sending Elena slamming into her seatbelt. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she struggled to regain control. The sound of something scraping against the back of the car echoed through the air. It was close. It was right there. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to know if it was still chasing her. Continuing the story. Elena's heart hammered against her chest as the car raced down the desolate road, the engine roaring in protest. The headlights blurred as she pushed the accelerator to the floor, desperately trying to outrun whatever was behind her. She couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. Not when she could feel the thing so close, so near that she could almost hear its breath on the back of her neck. Her eyes flicked nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. She couldn't stop looking back. Each time she dared glance in the mirror, the creature's silhouette was closer, its monstrous form almost filling the reflection. Its long, grotesque arms reached out, scraping against the back of the car, dragging against the metal with an eerie, screeching sound that sent a chill down her spine. Her hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was nothing but darkness and twisted trees. The occasional flicker of headlights ahead in the distance was just a cruel tease. There was no sign of any other cars. She was still alone in the night. The creature's clicking noise was louder now, almost rhythmic, like the sound of bones cracking with every step. It was closing in. She could hear its breathing too, low and ragged, but steady. It was gaining on her. She was almost too afraid to look again, but the reflex was overwhelming. She glanced in the rearview mirror one more time. What she saw almost made her lose control of the car. The creature was no longer just behind her, it was almost alongside her, keeping pace with the car. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow hue, flickering like dim lights in the darkness. Its face, twisted and contorted with hunger, was inches from the window, its breath fogging up the glass. The thing was right there, watching her. With a blood-curdling screech, its clawed hand reached out toward her, slamming against the rear window with such force that Elena screamed in terror. She yanked the steering wheel to the side, her tires screeching as she barely kept the car on the road, narrowly avoiding the trees. It wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a hunt. Her mind screamed at her to keep going, to push harder, to survive. But her limbs were heavy, her body frozen with fear. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was the only thing keeping her moving. Every instinct told her to stop, to pull over, to flee. But she couldn't. She couldn't let it catch her. Not after everything she had already seen. The world outside was a blur of dark shapes and shadows. The creature's clicking grew louder, but then, suddenly, it stopped. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The car was now traveling at terrifying speeds, and yet, the noise had ceased. The stillness of the night was suffocating, almost worse than the sounds that had come before. Her eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. There was nothing. For a brief, fleeting moment, Elena thought she had lost it. Maybe it had gone. Maybe it had retreated back into the woods. She could almost breathe again. The tension that had knotted her chest loosened slightly. Maybe, just maybe, it was finally over. But then the headlights illuminated something in the distance. A figure. Elena's stomach dropped. It wasn't the creature. It was someone else. Someone standing in the middle of the road, motionless, waiting. She slammed her foot on the brake, but the car didn't slow down. The figure was too close now. She couldn't avoid it. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the wheel, trying to swerve, but the figure didn't move. It didn't react. The car slammed into it with a sickening thud, the sound of bones cracking and glass shattering ringing in her ears. The force of the collision sent the car into a wild spin, the tires screeching as the vehicle veered off the road, careening into the trees. Elena screamed, the world tilting and spinning around her as the car rolled and slid to a halt, the engine sputtering to a stop. Dazed, her head spinning, Elena blinked through the haze of pain and shock. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest she could barely hear herself think. For a moment, all she could do was sit there, breathing heavily, trying to gather her bearings. When she finally opened her eyes, she saw it. The figure. The one she had collided with. It was standing beside the car, completely unscathed. The creature had never been behind her. It had never been chasing her at all. It had been leading her. And now, as the creature emerged from the woods, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness, Elena realized the truth. She had been lured here, deep into this forsaken stretch of road, and the thing that had been hunting her wasn't the only one of its kind. There were others. The figure stepped closer to the car, and Elena's blood ran cold. She could see its face now, but it wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over its skull. Its eyes were sunken deep into its sockets, and its mouth was wide open, too wide. Its teeth, sharp, jagged, and yellow, gleamed in the dim light. And then, the clicking sound started again. Louder this time. Echoing through the still night. Elena's breath quickened, and her heart raced in her chest. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. She had driven straight into the trap. With trembling hands, Elena tried to open the door, but it was jammed. Her eyes frantically searched the car for a way out. There was no escape. The figure was right there, its distorted smile growing wider, more monstrous, and the clicking sound, the bone-chilling clicking, was all around her now. And then the creature stepped into the light. The one from the woods. The one she had thought was gone. It had been waiting for her, just outside the car. Its long, twisted arms reached out toward her. Elena screamed, but it was too late. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her was its glowing yellow eyes staring into hers. Elena's vision swam as the world around her became a blur of black and red. The creature's chilling grip on her shoulder tightened, dragging her out of the car with ease. Her body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if every muscle had been drained of energy. The fear, sharp, raw, and paralyzing, washed over her, suffocating her ability to fight back. She was at its mercy now, caught in the jaws of something far beyond her understanding. Her mind screamed, but her voice failed her. The only thing she could do was look into the creature's eyes, those haunting, glowing yellow orbs that seemed to pierce through her very soul. She felt as though it was reading her, dissecting her thoughts, savoring her terror. The thing dragged her away from the wreckage of the car, its movements unnatural, almost fluid. Its skin, pale and stretched, rippled unnervingly as it walked. Elena's heart pounded against her chest, the frantic beats filling her ears. She tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. Her body felt as though it were being crushed under an invisible weight. Her surroundings were fading fast. The forest had become a blur of dark shapes and shadows. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, the creature's grip still tight around her arm. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Everything it did, everything it was, spoke for itself. Elena knew she was powerless against it. But even in her terror, a single thought bubbled to the surface of her mind: what did it want? The question lingered in her mind, an unsettling mystery she couldn't shake. Why was it tormenting her? Why had it followed her? Was it simply a creature of the woods, or was there something more sinister at play here? The creature dragged her toward a clearing. The moonlight was just enough to cast eerie shadows across the forest floor, but Elena's eyes remained locked on the creature. It didn't seem to care that it was being watched. Its attention was fixed solely on her. And then, as if reading her thoughts, the creature stopped. For a brief moment, it stood perfectly still, just inches away from her trembling body. Its head tilted to the side, and it regarded her with its piercing yellow eyes, as if weighing her very existence. In that moment, Elena felt an odd, intense connection to the creature. It wasn't just the terror anymore, it was something deeper, a strange awareness between them. She could feel the hunger within it, the raw, primal need that drove it. But just as quickly as the connection appeared, it vanished. The creature let out a low growl, a sound so guttural that it reverberated in her bones, and began to drag her forward again. Elena's mind raced. She couldn't give up now. She had to fight back. If she didn't, she was as good as dead. She searched her pockets frantically, but her hands were slick with sweat, and her movements were slow and uncoordinated. Then, as if on instinct, she reached into her jacket pocket and found the small knife she always carried with her when she drove through isolated areas like this. It wasn't much, but it was something. With shaky hands, she gripped the handle, feeling the cold metal against her palm. She waited. The creature was still focused on her, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Its grip on her arm was unrelenting, but it hadn't noticed her small knife yet. Her breath was shallow, her entire body trembling as she braced herself for what she was about to do. With a sudden burst of strength, Elena thrust the knife upward, aiming for the creature's arm. It connected with a sickening thunk, but the creature didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice the blade embedded in its skin. Instead, it laughed. The sound was like gravel scraping against metal, a low, terrifying rumble that made Elena's blood run cold. The creature looked down at her with amusement in its eyes. It was toying with her. Elena's mind raced. She had no choice now. She couldn't defeat it with strength alone. She had to think. She had to outsmart it. With a sudden, desperate move, she kicked out with her leg, striking the creature's knee. It stumbled, just enough to loosen its grip. Elena seized the opportunity. With a surge of adrenaline, she yanked herself free and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance between herself and the creature as possible. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The darkness seemed to swallow her, but her eyes never left the glowing yellow eyes of the creature in the distance. It was still following her. The clicking sound started again, growing louder, and Elena's heart thudded painfully in her chest. It was faster now. Every time she looked back, it was closer, its arms stretching out like grotesque tendrils. It was gaining on her. The woods were endless. She couldn't see the road anymore. The trees, twisted and gnarled, seemed to close in around her, trapping her in the heart of the forest. She stumbled over roots, her feet heavy, her breath ragged. Just when she thought she couldn't run any longer, a light appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, but as she drew closer, she realized it was coming from a cabin. Her heart leapt in her chest. A cabin. A way out. People. Safety. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The cabin loomed closer and closer, but when she reached the door, she found it locked. She pounded on it with her fists, yelling for help, but there was no answer. The creature was close now. She could hear it, feel it behind her, its footsteps growing louder. In desperation, she yanked at the door again. It finally gave way, the old wood creaking as it opened just enough for her to slip inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, and Elena collapsed to the floor. The cabin was dark, the air musty, and the floorboards creaked with every movement. But it was shelter. For now, she was safe. She could still hear the clicking sound, but it was far off now. She had to be safe. She had to be. As she sat there, gasping for breath, trying to steady her racing heart, Elena felt a strange, unsettling calm wash over her. She was safe. She had made it. But then, she heard it. A voice. Low. Raspy. Almost a whisper. You can't hide from it. Elena froze. She turned her head slowly, but there was no one else in the room. The voice came again. It's always watching. Her blood ran cold. The creature wasn't outside. It was inside. And now, Elena knew the truth. There was nowhere to run. There was no place safe. The creature had always been with her. Elena's pulse raced. Her heart thudded violently in her chest, and her breath became shallow, uneven. The voice, so cold, so calm, had come from inside the cabin, but there was no one here. She quickly scanned the dimly lit room, her eyes darting over every corner, but she saw nothing. Just the dusty furniture, the peeling wallpaper, and the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the corners. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more distinct. It's always watching. Always waiting. Elena's blood ran cold. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like they were made of stone. Every instinct told her to get up, to escape, to leave the cabin and never look back. But her body was frozen with fear. The voice, it was like a dark whisper in the back of her mind, clawing its way to the surface, seeping into her consciousness. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, she turned her head, following the direction of the voice. Her eyes landed on the far corner of the cabin, where an old mirror hung crookedly on the wall. In the reflection, she saw something that made her blood run ice cold. A shadow. A figure. Standing perfectly still, just out of sight. It wasn't the creature. At least, it didn't look like it. This figure was darker, more indistinct, as if it were a part of the cabin itself. But Elena could see its eyes. Two glowing yellow orbs, staring at her, watching her with an intensity that made her want to scream. But she couldn't. The figure stepped forward in the mirror, and she flinched back in terror. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment. The more Elena stared, the clearer it became, this wasn't just a reflection. The figure was in the cabin with her, right beside her. It was real. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't take her eyes off the mirror, couldn't tear herself away from the figure now moving closer to her. It hadn't made a sound, but she could feel it. The air had thickened, growing heavier with every passing second. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, trapping her. And then, it spoke. "You think you're safe? You think the road, the car, the darkness can protect you?" Elena tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She reached for the knife she had dropped when she entered the cabin, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She needed to escape. The door. The window. Anything. She couldn't stay here. But the voice. It spoke again. "It's too late." The figure in the mirror began to laugh. It was low at first, an eerie sound that seemed to echo through the room, reverberating in her mind. But as the laughter grew louder, Elena realized it wasn't just one voice, there were many voices, a chorus of whispers and giggles, all blending together, becoming indistinguishable from each other. "You were never meant to escape," it whispered, the voices multiplying until they filled the cabin with their cacophony. With a surge of panic, Elena sprang to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't know what to do, but she had to do something. She staggered towards the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but as she reached for the handle, she froze. The door was no longer the door. It was a wall. A wall of thick, inky darkness. She stepped back, her breathing quickening. The cabin had changed. The floor beneath her feet had become uneven, and the walls were no longer the weathered wood they once were. Everything was shifting, warping, as though the very fabric of reality itself was bending to some unknown force. The creature was still outside, waiting. She turned back toward the mirror. The figure was still there, but now, it was smiling. A wide, twisted grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across its face, as if it was both amused and hungry at the same time. The yellow eyes gleamed brighter now, brighter than before, and Elena realized with a jolt that they were not just watching her. They were feasting on her fear. "There's no way out," it said, its voice now an echo of hundreds of whispers, each one a separate thread of malice and torment. "You were always meant to be here." Her breath hitched in her throat. She had to do something. She couldn't let this thing, or whatever it was, win. She had to fight, even if she didn't know how. With trembling hands, she grabbed a nearby chair, holding it up like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was something. The mirror seemed to flicker, the reflection distorting for a split second, and Elena took that moment to throw the chair. It shattered against the glass, sending a violent crack through the reflection. The figure in the mirror let out a horrible shriek, but it didn't disappear. It stepped closer, stepping out of the mirror and into the real world. Its twisted smile grew wider, its eyes glowing brighter, the yellow orbs now so intense they seemed to burn through the darkness. Elena stumbled back, her heart racing. She had just broken the mirror, but what she hadn't realized was that she had also shattered the barrier between the real world and whatever nightmare had been lurking inside it. The creature was no longer just in the reflection. It was standing right before her. Its long, jagged limbs reached out for her, the claws scraping against the wood of the floor with a sound that sent shivers up her spine. It leaned in close, its breath hot and fetid against her skin. "You can't run," it whispered, the voice seeping into her mind, invading her thoughts. "There's nowhere left to hide." In that moment, everything inside her broke. The sheer terror of it, the hopelessness, the crushing weight of her situation, it all surged inside her, making her knees buckle. She collapsed to the floor, her eyes wide with fear, unable to move, unable to fight. The creature crouched in front of her, its twisted grin spreading further across its face. Its long fingers brushed her hair aside, its touch cold and slick, like the skin of something long dead. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It froze mid-movement, its expression changing from one of hunger to something darker. It stared at Elena for a moment longer, then stood up slowly. The creature took a step back, its eyes still locked on her. It was gone. In the blink of an eye, it was simply gone. Elena didn't dare move. She was too afraid to even breathe. Was it over? Was it gone for good? She didn't know. She couldn't know. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the calm before the storm. And then, just as her mind began to wander, just as she allowed herself to believe she was safe, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The front door slammed open. And there, standing in the doorway, was the creature, and it was no longer alone. The creature in the doorway grinned wider, its yellow eyes gleaming with malice. Behind it, the shadows seemed to twist and writhe, and out of the darkness stepped two more figures. Their forms were twisted, disjointed, like they had been torn from some nightmare and stitched together in haste. They moved silently, their eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized, with a sickening certainty, that she was trapped. There was no escape, no way out. The door had slammed shut behind her, and now these things were closing in. The first creature took a step forward, its long fingers stretching towards her. Elena stumbled back, but the wall stopped her. She was cornered, with nowhere to run. Panic bubbled up in her throat, but she couldn't scream. The terror paralyzed her, freezing her in place. And then, as if the world had decided to grant her one final act of defiance, a flash of light pierced the gloom. It came from the cabin's window. In a single, frantic motion, Elena turned, her eyes wide with the possibility of escape. She lunged toward the window, hands desperate to claw at the old, rusted frame. She could hear the creatures behind her, their footsteps growing closer, their breathing heavy and labored. The window gave way with a loud crash. She climbed through, pain shooting up her arms as the sharp glass tore at her skin. She didn't care. She had to get out. The creature screeched behind her, but Elena didn't stop. She ran into the night, the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance as she pushed herself harder and harder. Every muscle in her body screamed with exhaustion, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to. She didn't know how long she ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around her, as though they were trying to swallow her whole. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. Finally, when the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Elena stumbled out of the forest. Her body was covered in cuts, bruises, and dirt, but she was alive. And the creatures? They were still out there. Somewhere. Waiting.